Stories of people abandoned on uninhabited islands are usually found in adventure novels or in the Great Discovery Chronicle. But it happened in the 20th century as well. Just over a century ago, a succession of wars and revolutions left 26 people stranded on a lonely atoll in the Pacific. We tell the harrowing tale of survival on Clipperton Island. On July 25, 1914, the USS Cleveland cruiser approached the tiny Pacific atoll of Clipperton, 1,240 kilometers from Acapulco. The guests were received by the Mexican governor of the atoll, Ramon Arnaud. The gringos told him about the World War and made it clear that it was unlikely that other ships would arrive in the foreseeable future, and certainly there would be no regular deliveries of food. If they did not leave the atoll now, they might not get another chance. He was personally appointed to Clipperton by Mexican President Porfirio Diaz. This circumstance alone forced Arnaud to accept a post that was more akin to exile. Although the Diaz regime was overthrown in 1911, Arnaud remained loyal to his oath and refused to leave Clipperton without orders from Mexico City. In addition, the news that the U.S. Army had invaded his home state of Veracruz did not add to Arnaud's confidence in his guests. He stated that his men had food supplies for 5 months, and then we'd see. 19 crewmen from the schooner Nakoma, which had been wrecked off the atoll, and the last British Pacific Island Company employee who had lived on Clipperton boarded the cruiser. The Americans gave the inhabitants some provisions and headed back. 14 men, 6 women, and 6 children remained on the atoll. The next ship would come ashore in 3 years. Before 1910, the prospects for settlers on Clipperton seemed quite bright. The British Pacific Island Company entered into an agreement with the Mexican authorities for the joint extraction of guano, naturally decomposed seabird droppings that were valued as fertilizer. A mine was built, wagon rails laid, houses erected for the inhabitants, and a lighthouse built on a 29-meter cliff in the southeastern part of the island. A total of about 100 people settled here. They were Mexican servicemen and their families, a company representative, and workers hired in San Francisco. Alicia brought her best dresses, jewelry, and even a gramophone to Clipperton. She took on the role of beneficent caretaker of the community. Soon the couple had 2 children, whom the parents named after themselves, Ramon and Alicia. Life on Clipperton was simple and harsh, but the islanders loved it. The children grew up on the ocean, and ships regularly brought groceries, books and magazines, new records for the gramophone, and even fertile soil for the vegetable gardens. They probably felt like colonists from the time of the great geographical discoveries, only to be provided with almost every benefit of civilization. The happy life did not last long. By 1910, the British Pacific Island Company concluded that the guano on Clipperton was of too low a quality and too expensive to deliver to the mainland. The British gradually went out of business, leaving the island without food supplies in 1913. Captain Arnaud and Alicia went to Mexico City to arrange a supply for Clipperton. Mexico had been in civil war for 3 years, but Arnaud managed to negotiate with the new president, Victoriano Huerta, that a ship carrying food would come to the atoll from Acapulco every 2 months. The president stated that the Mexican garrison at Clipperton was very important because it sent a message to foreign powers that Mexico, despite domestic problems, did not intend to give up its territories. In January 1914, Arnaud, Alicia, and their daughter Olga, who was born in Mexico City, returned to Clipperton. By then, rumors of the captain's visit to the presidential palace in Mexico City had reached Huerta's enemies. This led to unexpected complications. The ship that had delivered the first shipment of supplies to the atoll was sunk by revolutionary troops on the second voyage. The American sailors of the Cleveland were the last people who could have saved the inhabitants of the atoll from the impending nightmare. There is still debate as to why Ramon Arnaud did not take the opportunity to evacuate the garrison or at least send the women and children to Mexico. It is possible that he was simply afraid to send his family home because of the Civil War. In addition, President Huerta's enemies knew of Arnaud's visit to Mexico City, so his family and the families of his fellow soldiers could well expect reprisals. Arnaud figured they could sit out the conflict in Clipperton. In fact, long before the Cleveland arrived, the 3 sailors of the wrecked Nakoma on the Clipperton sailed to the Big Land by boat and surprisingly managed to cover more than 1,000 kilometers to Acapulco. And then something happened about which the researchers still have no consensus. According to one version, for some reason they did not inform the local authorities of the plight of their comrades and local residents left on the island. According to another, the revolutionary authorities refused to save the American sailors and the islanders loyal to the central government. Clipperton Atoll has a long and complicated history. Spanish explorers are believed to have discovered the island as early as the 16th century, but it was named after the English privateer John Clipperton, who supposedly visited it in 1705 and later allegedly made it the base for his pirate raids. However, there is no reliable documentary evidence of this. Apparently, the island has been discovered several times, since it was already an active shipping area centuries ago. In 1711, for example, French ships passed by the island, the crews of which drew the first detailed description of the atoll. One way or another, from the 1730s on the maps it was referred to as Clipperton. The atoll became part of France in 1858. More precisely, the French declared it their territory. However, 2 years before that, the US authorities claimed the right to mine guano on Clipperton. Mexico declared the atoll to be part of its territory in 1897. The government of the country insisted that it was the successor of the Spanish Empire in South America and had the right to the territories it had discovered. A garrison under the command of Ramon Arnaud, which appeared on Clipperton in 1906, was to repel other powers should they think of doing business there. The atoll was then leased to the British Pacific Island Company for guano mining, the income from which was to enrich both sides. Food supplies were rapidly running out. For the second half of 1914, the inhabitants finished the provisions previously stocked and left behind by the crew of the Cleveland. The men decided that their families should receive their food first. There were several coconut palms growing on the island. Arnaud established an order whereby each woman and child received 1 coconut a week. The soldiers were to eat their prey of crabs, birds, and their eggs. There were no fish in the lagoon of the island, for the water was fresh, stagnant, and strongly sulfurous, and from the ocean sharks mostly came to the shores of Clipperton, so that fishing at sea was very dangerous. The islanders had no problems with drinking water, thanks to the frequent rains. Very soon the Clippertonians began to suffer from scurvy. In late 1914 and early 1915, 15 men died, mostly soldiers who gave most of their meat and coconuts to their wives and children. Captain Arnaud and 3 of his subordinates died on May 5, 1915. As the governor's son Ramon recounted, he and his father and mother were at home when Alicia Jr. ran into the room and said that a ship was in sight on the horizon. The ship, according to Arnaud Jr.'s recollection, was sailing without a flag. The men rowed as hard as they could, trying to reach the unknown vessel, but soon the powerful waves broke the oars, and the boat was left without control. A few minutes later, she was swept away by a wave. Ramon Arnaud and his shipmates drowned, and the crew of the unknown vessel never noticed that the island was inhabited. Alicia Arnaud, her maid, Teresa, and the wives of the dead soldiers, Altagracia and Juana, were left with their 6 children on the island. After mourning the dead, they took over all the cares of maintaining life in the colony. The women hunted, gathered coconuts, caught crabs, and made sure their children survived. There was, however, one man left on the island, whose name is associated with the darkest and most gruesome pages of Clipperton's history. Upon learning of the death of his last co-workers, lighthouse keeper Victoriano Alvarez sprang into action. He lived secluded in a hut at the foot of the lighthouse cliff and was out of touch with the rest of the islanders for a long time. According to one version, he had long been presumed dead. Remaining the only man on the island, Alvarez somehow took possession of all the garrison's weapons and threw them into the sea, leaving himself with a single rifle. He entered the village, declared himself king of Clipperton, and began regularly taking food from women and children and raping islander women. He threatened to throw those who resisted into the ocean to be eaten by sharks. The scare action worked. The harem of the distraught Mexican soldier included two 30-year-old women and the 13-year-old daughter of one of them. He did not touch Alicia Arnault, but for 2 years the other women and girls of suffered his violence. The nightmare ended on the night of July 18, 1917, when Alicia and her maid Teresa both attacked Alvarez and beat him with hammers. On the same day, July 23, according to other reports, the American warship Yorktown approached the island and its crew was ordered to check for Germans on Clipperton. Instead of a German submarine base, the astonished sailors found 4 women with 8 children on the atoll. They were dressed in clothes of sailcloth, terribly emaciated, and in a severe psychological state bordering on insanity. The last residents of Clipperton were taken to Salina Cruz, Mexico. Today there are different opinions about what happened in Clipperton. Some believe that the tragedy happened because of the stubbornness of Ramon Arnault, who continued to carry out the orders of the long-deposed government and is therefore responsible for the deaths of his fellow soldiers. In any case, in 1931 Mexico officially renounced its claim to Clipperton, and it finally became French. After that, French authorities offered citizenship to 10 surviving Clippertonians, but none of them agreed. The tragedy that occurred on Clipperton Atoll more than a century ago is still full of mysteries today, and researchers continue to write books about these terrible events and try to find the missing facts in order to fully reconstruct the causes of what happened.